historic tragedy unfolds in shocking footage.
May 26, 1941. The North Atlantic. In the freezing, storm-tossed darkness, a biplane that belonged in a museum climbed shakily into the howling wind, carrying a torpedo toward the most powerful battleship ever built by Germany. What happened next would change the course of World War II. This is the story of how obsolete aircraft from the First World War crippled the pride of Hitler's navy in one of the most unlikely victories in naval history. Picture this. It's the evening of May 26th, and the deck of HMS Royal is pitching violently in a ferocious gale. The wind is screaming at over 50 knots. Waves the size of buildings are crashing over the carrier's bow. And standing on that heaving deck are 15 fabric-covered biplanes that look like they've time-traveled from 1918. These are Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, affectionately nicknamed string bags by their crews. And they're about to take off into conditions that would ground modern aircraft. The pilots climbing into those open cockpits knew exactly what they were facing. Somewhere out there in the darkness and storm was the Bismarck, a floating fortress of steel that displaced over 50,000 tons and bristled with hundreds of guns. She was running for the safety of German-occupied France, and if she made it, the war in the Atlantic could be lost. The Swordfish crews were Britain's last hope. No pressure, right? Let me take you back 2 days to understand how we got here. May 24th, 1941. The Denmark Strait, between Greenland and Iceland. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the most famous warship in the world, was steaming at full speed to intercept the Bismarck. Hood was massive, over 48,000 tons of steel and firepower. She'd been the largest warship in the world for over 20 years. The British people believed she was invincible. Sailors used to say, if you see the Hood, you know the Royal Navy is in control. But Hood had a problem. She was old. Launched back in 1918, right at the end of the First World War, she'd been designed before naval architects fully understood the dangers of long-range plunging fire. Her deck armor, the horizontal protection that shields a ship from shells falling from above, was inadequate by 1941 standards. Everyone in the Admiralty knew Hood desperately needed a complete rebuild, but there simply wasn't time. The war waited for no one. At 5:36 in the morning, Hood spotted the Bismarck. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag in Hood, immediately ordered his ships to engage. Hood was accompanied by HMS Prince of Wales, a brand new battleship that had been commissioned just 3 months earlier. Prince of Wales was so new that civilian technicians were still aboard working out mechanical problems with her gun turrets. Talk about going into battle untested. The Germans weren't surprised. Their radar had detected the British ships approaching. Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, were ready. And here's where things get interesting from a tactical perspective. Admiral Holland made a critical decision. He ordered his ships to close the range quickly, heading almost directly toward the German vessels. This meant Hood and Prince of Wales could only use their forward guns, while Bismarck and Prinz Eugen could fire full broadsides, bringing all their weapons to bear. The distance closed rapidly. 17 miles, 16 miles, 15 miles. At 5:52, Hood opened fire on what her crew thought was the Bismarck, but was actually Prinz Eugen. The Germans had cleverly positioned the cruiser in the lead. Prince of Wales correctly identified Bismarck and engaged her. The German ships returned fire immediately. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Prinz Eugen's third or fourth salvo struck Hood and started a fire on her boat deck. The blaze spread quickly, fed by ready-use anti-aircraft ammunition stored there. Crew members could see the flames, but at 28 knots, the wind made firefighting impossible. Then Bismarck found her range. It was approximately 5:59, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning. Bismarck's fifth salvo, 8 15-inch shells screaming through the air at over 2,000 feet per second. One of those shells, maybe more, struck Hood somewhere near her aft magazines. And in that instant, the impossible happened. The mighty Hood, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, exploded. Survivors described it as a massive eruption of flame that shot hundreds of feet into the air. The ship's back broke. Her bow rose up, pointing toward the sky, and then she was gone. 3 minutes. That's all it took for Hood to go from a fighting warship to a tomb at the bottom of the Denmark Strait. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. 3. Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas. That's it. The shock in Britain was indescribable. The Hood was more than just a ship. She was a symbol of British naval power, a floating ambassador that had visited ports around the world. People simply couldn't believe she was gone. And the loss wasn't just symbolic. With Hood destroyed and Prince of Wales damaged and forced to break off the engagement, Bismarck was still loose in the Atlantic. The nightmare scenario the Admiralty had feared was unfolding. But the battle hadn't been entirely one-sided. Prince of Wales, despite her mechanical problems, had managed to score 3 hits on Bismarck before withdrawing. One of those hits was crucial. A 14-inch shell struck Bismarck's bow, penetrating a fuel tank. The shell didn't explode, it was a dud, but the hole it made allowed seawater to contaminate hundreds of tons of fuel oil. Another hit ruptured a different fuel tank, causing the ship to leave a telltale oil slick behind her. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the German squadron from Bismarck's bridge, had a decision to make. His original mission was to break out into the Atlantic and wreak havoc on British convoys. But now he was damaged, leaking fuel, and the entire Royal Navy would be hunting him. He made the call: abort the mission. Head for Brest in occupied France where Bismarck could be repaired. It was the smart decision, but it meant running a gauntlet of British ships across over 1,000 miles of open ocean. The British were mobilizing everything they had. Admiral John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, was racing south in HMS King George V with the battleship Rodney. Force H, based at Gibraltar, was steaming north with the carrier Ark Royal. Cruisers and destroyers were converging from multiple directions. The hunt was on. For a while, it looked like Bismarck might escape. On the evening of May 24th, she managed to slip away from the British cruisers shadowing her. For over 30 hours, the most powerful battleship in the German Navy simply vanished. The Royal Navy was frantically searching hundreds of square miles of ocean. Fuel was running low on the British ships. Time was running out. Then, at 10:30 on the morning of May 26th, a Catalina flying boat from RAF Coastal Command spotted Bismarck. She was heading southeast, making for France, and she was only about 700 miles from safety. Within 24 hours, she'd be under the protective umbrella of German air cover and U-boats. Admiral Tovey's battleships were too far away to catch her before she reached that protection. But HMS Ark Royal was within striking distance. And this is where our obsolete biplanes enter the story. The Fairey Swordfish was, even by 1941 standards, a relic. It had first flown back in 1934, and its design philosophy came straight from the First World War. Open cockpits, fabric-covered wings and fuselage, fixed landing gear, struts and bracing wires everywhere. It looked like something from a museum should not be going into combat against the most modern battleship afloat. The Swordfish had a maximum speed of about 140 miles per hour in level flight, when carrying a torpedo that dropped to maybe 120. Bismarck could make over 30 knots, which is about 35 miles per hour. Think about that. The attacking aircraft was only about 3 times faster than its target. Modern jet aircraft attack at speeds hundreds of miles per hour faster than their targets. The Swordfish crews would have to fly low and slow, straight and level, to drop their torpedoes accurately. They'd be sitting ducks. But the Swordfish had some advantages that nobody fully appreciated at the time. That slow speed and old-fashioned design made it incredibly maneuverable. Could turn on a dime. The fabric covering on the wings made it light and allowed it to fly in weather conditions that would ground all-metal aircraft. And here's the kicker, it was so slow that it flew below the minimum tracking speed of some modern fire control systems. Bismarck's advanced anti-aircraft directors had been designed to track fast modern aircraft. The Swordfish confused them. The first strike from Ark Royal on the afternoon of May 26th was a disaster, but not because of the Germans. Remember, Bismarck had escaped shadowing. The British had lost track of her exact position. When Ark Royal's radar picked up a ship in the storm, the Swordfish crews assumed it was Bismarck or Prinz Eugen. 11 Swordfish attacked, Torpedoes dropped, some crew members already celebrating the hits. Then somebody looked closer at the target. It was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been sent ahead to shadow Bismarck. The Swordfish had just attacked their own side. Miraculously, none of the torpedoes hit Sheffield. 6 of them exploded prematurely when they struck the water, a problem with the magnetic detonators. Sheffield dodged the rest. One pilot reportedly blinked a signal lamp message at the cruiser. Sorry for the kipper. British understatement at its finest. But the mistake had one silver lining. The Swordfish crews now knew the magnetic detonators were unreliable. When they rearmed for the second strike, they switched to old-fashioned contact detonators. Sheffield relocated Bismarck and began shadowing her, sending a stream of position reports. At 7:10 in the evening of May 26th, 15 Swordfish stood on Ark Royal's pitching deck. The wind was howling at over 50 knots, creating a relative wind speed over the deck of about 56 knots. For perspective, hurricane force winds start at 74 miles per hour, which is about 64 knots. The Swordfish were taking off in near hurricane conditions. The pilots nursed their aircraft into the air one by one. Each Swordfish carried a crew of 3, pilot in the front cockpit, observer-navigator in the middle, and telegraphist air gunner in the rear cockpit. They were crammed into that tiny fuselage with no heating, minimal protection from the wind and rain, and a torpedo slung underneath that weighed almost 2,000 pounds. The fuel tanks, the engine, the torpedo, all of it wrapped in fabric and wood. One good hit and they'd explode or break apart. They climbed into the storm, flying in formation through driving rain and low clouds. Visibility was almost zero. Finding Bismarck in these conditions would be like finding a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was trying to kill you. They used ASV radar, primitive by modern standards but cutting edge for 1941. The radar operator in each aircraft stared at a flickering green screen, watching for the telltale blip that would indicate a large ship. At around 8:47, they spotted her. Bismarck, alone in the storm, her massive silhouette unmistakable even through the rain and mist. The German lookouts saw the Swordfish approaching. Alarm bells rang throughout the ship. Gun crews raced to their stations. Every weapon that could elevate high enough swiveled toward the incoming aircraft. And then Bismarck opened fire. Imagine being in one of those Swordfish. You're sitting in an open cockpit, wind and rain lashing your face, your aircraft bucking and shaking in the turbulence. And suddenly the sky around you erupts with exploding shells. Bismarck's anti-aircraft battery was formidable. 16 4.1-inch guns, 16 37mm guns, and multiple 20mm cannons. They threw up a wall of steel and fire. Shells were exploding so close that the shock waves buffeted the flimsy Swordfish, tossing them around like leaves. The German gunners even fired the main battery, the massive 15-inch guns, at the aircraft. Can you imagine? Guns designed to sink battleships at 20 miles being used against biplanes. The shells created enormous waterspouts when they hit the ocean, walls of water 30 or 40 feet high. One Swordfish flew so close to a waterspout that it was lifted up, the bottom of the fuselage torn open by the force. The aircraft kept flying. That's how tough these little planes were. The Swordfish split up, attacking from different angles to divide Bismarck's fire. This was standard torpedo bomber tactics. Come in low, just above the wave tops, maybe 20 feet off the water. Point your aircraft not at where the ship is, but at where it will be by the time the torpedo reaches it. The Swordfish had a crude aiming system, essentially a row of lights that the pilot used to estimate the correct lead angle. No computers, no sophisticated targeting systems, just skill, judgment, and nerve. Sub-Lieutenant Jock Moffat was 21 years old. His observer, Dusty Miller, and his air gunner, Albert Heyman, were hunched in the cramped fuselage behind him. They came in on Bismarck's port quarter, the anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like hail. Miller kept telling Moffat, not yet, waiting for the perfect moment. Then finally let her go. Moffat pressed the release button. The torpedo dropped away with a splash. As Moffat threw the Swordfish into a hard turn to escape, Miller spotted the torpedo's track in the water. "We've got a runner, Jock." A runner meant the torpedo was running true, heading for the target. They couldn't watch the impact. They were too busy dodging anti-aircraft fire and getting out of there. But as Moffat's Swordfish clawed for altitude, something happened aboard Bismarck. The torpedo struck her port side, aft, near the stern. In most places, it would have done minor damage. Bismarck's torpedo protection system was excellent. But this torpedo hit in almost the worst possible spot. It struck right next to the port rudder coupling. The explosion was violent. Water and fire erupted inside the steering compartment. The shock wave rippled through the stern structure, which was less heavily armored than the main hull. And then, disaster. The port rudder jammed at a 12-degree angle to port. 12 degrees doesn't sound like much, but on a ship the size of Bismarck, it was catastrophic. She started turning in a wide circle, swinging back toward her pursuers. Damage control teams rushed to the stern, trying to free the jammed rudder. Divers were sent into flooded compartments. They couldn't reach the damage. The steering gear rooms were flooded and inaccessible. One diver nearly died when his air hose snagged on twisted metal. The crew tried everything. They attempted to steer using the starboard rudder alone, but the port rudder was still stuck, fighting against it. They tried using the propellers at different speeds to turn the ship, but Bismarck's 3-shaft arrangement wasn't effective for that. Other battleships with 4 shafts could steer reasonably well with their propellers. Bismarck couldn't. Someone suggested blasting the jammed rudder off with explosives, but Admiral Lutyens feared that would damage the propeller shafts or screws. At 9:15 in the evening, Lutyens sent a signal to Berlin. "Ship unmaneuverable." Those 2 words sealed Bismarck's fate. She was doomed. The Royal Navy's battleships were closing in, and she could only steam in circles. All because of one torpedo from one obsolete biplane flown by a 21-year-old pilot. Here's what makes this so remarkable. That torpedo could have hit anywhere along Bismarck's 823-foot length. It could have struck amidships where the armor was thickest and done minimal damage. Could have missed entirely. The Swordfish were attacking in terrible weather, at night, against a target maneuvering violently and throwing up massive amounts of anti-aircraft fire. The odds of scoring a hit were low. The odds of that hit being in exactly the right or wrong place were astronomical. Some historians call it luck. And sure, there was an element of fortune involved. But it wasn't just luck. Those Swordfish crews were highly trained. They'd practiced torpedo attacks over and over, learning to judge speed and distance and lead angle. They knew their aircraft intimately, understanding exactly how the Swordfish would handle in different conditions. And they were brave beyond measure, flying into that hell of anti-aircraft fire in aircraft that offered almost no protection. Let me tell you about another hit that night. At least one other torpedo struck Bismarck amidships, hitting the armor belt and doing negligible damage. That's what should have happened to all the torpedoes. Bismarck was designed to absorb that kind of punishment. But the stern was a weak point, a design flaw that German engineers had noted in other ships. The rudders and steering gear weren't as well protected as they should have been. It was a vulnerability inherited from World War I era designs. All 15 Swordfish made it back to Ark Royal. Not a single aircraft was lost, though several were damaged. The return flight was almost as dangerous as the attack. They had to find the carrier in pitch darkness and storm conditions, then land on a deck that was pitching and rolling violently. But they all made it. As they climbed out of their cockpits, drenched and exhausted, the crews didn't know yet what their attack had achieved. They'd seen some explosions, thought they might have scored a couple of hits, but they had no idea they'd just crippled the Bismarck. Throughout that night, British destroyers harassed Bismarck, attacking with torpedoes and forcing the German crew to remain at battle stations. None of the destroyer torpedoes hit, but they kept the pressure on. The Germans couldn't make any meaningful repairs because they were constantly under threat. Exhaustion set in. The crew was running on adrenaline and fear. Dawn broke on May 27th, and Bismarck's situation was hopeless. Admiral Tovey's battleships, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, appeared on the horizon. The engagement began at 8:47 in the morning. Bismarck, still circling helplessly, tried to fight back, but her fate was sealed. The British battleships pounded her at close range, their shells smashing through her superstructure, destroying her fire control systems, silencing her guns one by one. Rodney carried 9 16-inch guns, the largest in the British fleet. King George V had 10 14-inch guns. Together, they rained destruction on Bismarck. Witnesses described it as like watching a man beating a dying animal. Bismarck couldn't maneuver. She could barely shoot back, but she wouldn't sink. Her hull was incredibly tough, her internal compartmentalization superb. The British fired hundreds of shells into her. The cruiser HMS Dorsetshire closed in and fired torpedoes from both sides. Finally, at around 10:40 in the morning, Bismarck capsized and sank. Survivors later reported that the crew had opened scuttling valves and set demolition charges to ensure she went down. Whether she sank because of British fire or German scuttling is still debated. Probably it was both. The British had beaten her into a wreck, and the Germans finished the job to prevent her capture. Of Bismarck's crew of 2,222 men, only 110 survived. The British rescued who they could, but a U-boat alarm forced them to break off rescue operations, leaving hundreds of German sailors in the water. It was a tragedy on top of a tragedy. The wreck of Bismarck was discovered in 1989 by Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who found the Titanic. She lies upright on an underwater mountain, nearly 16,000 feet below the surface. Examination of the wreck confirmed the rudder damage. The stern structure had partially collapsed onto the rudders from the force of the torpedo explosion and the structural whipping it caused. The ship's designers had created a rigid steering gear complex protected by thick armor, but the unarmored stern structure around it was relatively flexible. When the torpedo detonated, the stern whipped violently at a different frequency than the main hull, tearing open seams and bulkheads. So what can we learn from this incredible story? First, never underestimate the underdog. The Swordfish was obsolete, slow, fragile. By all rights, it should have been a footnote in aviation history. But in the right circumstances, with the right crew, that obsolete biplane accomplished what modern aircraft might not have. Its slow speed was an advantage against fire control systems designed for faster targets. Its maneuverability let it dodge through anti-aircraft fire that would have shredded a faster, less agile aircraft. Second, every design has vulnerabilities. Bismarck was a masterpiece of naval engineering in many ways. Powerful guns, thick armor, advanced fire control. But that unprotected rudder was an Achilles heel. The Germans knew about this weakness. Similar torpedo damage had crippled the cruiser Prinz Eugen and the pocket battleship Bletsoe. Improvements were made to later ships, but for Bismarck, the flaw was fatal. Third, training and courage matter more than technology. Those Swordfish crews weren't flying cutting-edge fighters or bombers. They were in fabric-covered biplanes that looked like museum pieces. But they were superbly trained, and they were willing to fly into conditions and combat situations that seemed suicidal in hindsight. That combination of skill and bravery turned an obsolete aircraft into a weapon that changed history. The sinking of the Bismarck had huge strategic implications. Adolf Hitler was so shaken by the loss that he became extremely cautious about using surface ships against Britain. The German Navy's focus shifted almost entirely to U-boats. If Bismarck had reached France, been repaired, and returned to raiding convoys, the Battle of the Atlantic could have gone very differently. Britain depended on those convoys for survival. Losing significant numbers of merchant ships to a raider as powerful as Bismarck could have strangled Britain's war effort. And it's worth noting what happened to some of those Swordfish crews. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, who led the attack from HMS Victorious on May 24th, later led 6 Swordfish in an attack on the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during the Channel Dash in February 1942. All 6 Swordfish were shot down. Esmond and his entire crew were killed. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor. Even the German Admiral Otto Ciliax called it one of the finest exhibitions of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty the war had ever witnessed. That's the reality of war. The same men who crippled Bismarck, flying the same type of aircraft, were slaughtered less than a year later in a different tactical situation. Courage doesn't guarantee survival. Sometimes the underdog wins. Sometimes they don't. The Fairey Swordfish served throughout World War II. It sank more Axis shipping tonnage than any other Allied aircraft. It participated in the famous attack on Taranto, where Swordfish from HMS Illustrious crippled the Italian fleet in a nighttime raid that inspired the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It hunted U-boats in the Atlantic, pioneered the use of radar for anti-submarine work. It flew from escort carriers protecting convoys. And it did all this while being obsolete before the war even started. Production of the Swordfish continued until August 1944, long after more modern aircraft like the Fairey Albacore and Fairey Barracuda were available. Why? Because it worked. Because crews trusted it. Because in certain roles, particularly anti-submarine warfare from small escort carriers, the Swordfish was actually better than its more modern replacements. About 2,400 Swordfish were built in total. The last operational Swordfish flight was June 28, 1945, a month and a half after Germany surrendered. By that time, jet aircraft were already in combat. The technological gap between the Swordfish and contemporary aircraft had become a chasm. But the old string bag had done its job and earned its place in history. Today, a few Swordfish still exist in museums and private collections. Seeing one in person, it's shocking how fragile they look. The fabric covering, the exposed framework, the tiny cockpits. It's hard to imagine men climbing into these things and flying into combat against warships bristling with guns. But they did. And on one stormy night in May 1941, one of those crews dropped one torpedo in exactly the right place and changed the course of the war. The hunt for the Bismarck lasted 8 days from when she left port to when she sank. In that time, she destroyed the Hood, damaged the Prince of Wales, and led the Royal Navy on one of the greatest naval chases in history. But in the end, she was stopped by a slow, obsolete biplane carrying a torpedo. Sometimes in war, as in life, the most unlikely hero makes all the difference. So the next time someone tells you that old technology is useless, that only the newest and most advanced equipment matters, remember the Swordfish and the Bismarck. Remember that on a dark, stormy night in the North Atlantic, a fabric-covered biplane from the First World War era brought down the mightiest battleship of the Second World War with one lucky shot that wasn't entirely luck at all.